Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our lunch briefing. My name is Jacqueline Côté. I'm the Director of Public Relations here at the Institute. Sorry for the few minutes delay due to an accident on the highway. I'm very pleased to be hosting this event, which comes very timely, thanks to two of our professors who will be commenting on the Israeli elections. You have all followed last week's election where we saw some quite striking results. So to understand the results of these elections and also the consequence on the Israeli-Palestine conflict, I'm pleased to introduce to you two of our professors, Cyrus Schayegh, who will speak first, I believe, who's a new professor of international history, and Riccardo Bocco, who will follow with some comments on the presentations of Cyrus, who is a professor in our anthropology and sociology department. So as with all of our lunch briefing, the event should terminate in about an hour, so at 1:35, so we have a bit of time to have lunch before the afternoon starts. So without further ado, Cyrus, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll take 10 minutes. It will be bare bones. Q&A will follow after Professor Bocco's presentation, our quick discussion. So you'll be able to sort of follow up. Okay, let's see. First, the what. The Likud is together with the new Blue and White Party, the biggest party in the new parliament with 35 seats. Second, the right-wing bloc has a majority, 65 seats. Right now, a few minutes ago, all those 65 have recommended the president of Israel to charge Netanyahu with forming the next government. Whether that indeed will happen, of course, is still not entirely clear, but it's very, very likely, I would say. As you can see, lots of other parties, including parties of a religious nature on the right, and two Palestinian Arab parties on the left. Labour, once a really big, actually the biggest party in Israel, has totally collapsed to 6 seats, and Meretz, once also much bigger, has sort of shrunk a bit to 4 seats. Explanation. One way of thinking about this is to say that there was a double status quo implemented here. Most, but of course not all Israelis, wanted a continuation of policy of no peace and no war. By no war, I don't mean no war ever, but from the perspective of right-wingers in Israel, no unnecessary war. That came together with a basically status quo in personality. Netanyahu is seen not simply as Mr. Security, but more so as a Mr. Security with a global, basically span, with contacts all over the world. Some people on the right recognize that he has serious legal problems. Some don't believe these are true, but I would say that even those who do believe they're true think that they're ultimately much less important than simply having him still on board. Now, and being the next prime minister. Now, this double status quo, however, and this is important to point out, I think, has affected the domestic status quo in Israel in the last 3 years. Firstly, partly because of Netanyahu, but also more broadly because of the right-wing deepening, anti-Arab racism has very much deepened in the last few years. And secondly, state institutions, including the judiciary, including the police, that have sort of tried to oppose, or at least try to sort of, let's say, qualify what Netanyahu and people around him are doing, have been targeted. To the parties. The Likud could be called the status quo party. As I said, no new leader. We don't want any new leader. We don't want any new policy platform. We want no war, no peace. However, importantly, 1 or 2 days before the elections, Netanyahu, in order to get as many right-wing voters as possible, made a vague promise to extend Israeli sovereignty to settlements in the West Bank. That's an important sort of change. Whatever it will mean later on, it remains to be seen, though. No war, again, that doesn't mean no war whatsoever, but no unnecessary war. I don't know whether you have followed the news, but roughly 2 weeks before the election, Hamas, of course, in a much larger context, sent a few missiles into Israel. Netanyahu could have tried to basically go for war. He did not. Others wanted him to. He refused. And that has happened before too. Though in other contexts, he very much was able and willing to go into Gaza. That, of course, absolutely needs to be said too. Against the Arabs, and that includes the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and last but not least saying that this new blue and left party are really leftists. This is what the Likud said. These guys are leftists, you cannot trust them. You have to vote for us. Getting to the blue and white party, there's a big failure and a big success, or maybe a sort of a success. The failure had to do with the inability of blue and white to gather, or rather pull enough Likud voters or other right-wing voters from the overall right-wing bloc. Remember, this bloc here on the right, towards them. And that meant that ultimately the right-wing bloc was big enough to very probably basically be the new government. And that happened although the blue-white leadership, including 3 generals, had a very tough sort of right-wing rhetoric and basically were not very clear about being in favor of the two-state solution. In other words, in rhetoric and in policy, they should have been attractive enough for at least some Likud voters, but that wasn't enough yet. They weren't Netanyahu. The Likud mainly wanted Netanyahu, and that's what they voted for. A sort of a success in the sense that they, as it is being called in Hebrew, drank Labour's voters. That means they attracted the voters of the Labour Party as well as others and became basically the cause for an intra-bloc, intra-left consolidation of sorts. Blue and white had 35 seats, exactly as many as the Likud. And that was possible because they were very strongly anti-Netanyahu and because they insisted that they want to try to, again, honor those institutions that I just talked about right here on the very bottom. We have a slew of right-wing parties. In is a new coalition of older parties, which is called United Right. That includes an old settled party and a really arch-racist so-called Jewish Might party. Netanyahu helped to set about. He was basically really the sort of the aider and abettor of this coalition. And he also helped to basically put it together by agreeing on some sort of electoral vote sharing, which is very complicated technical. I'm not going to get into this. But he was directly involved in all of this. Up by a little bit, not too much, but significant little bit, are 2 religious parties, including Shas. And out, really interestingly, is a new party that was formed in December, the so-called New Right Party, led by Schayegh and Bennett. For different reasons we can go into in the Q&A. We can also talk about other parties and the US in the Q&A. I will skip the Palestinians. Riccardo, Bocco will talk about them, and I come straight to bottom line number 1, domestics. Netanyahu bested 3 generals, 3 ex-chief of staffs. This should give all those who think that generals are basically the A and the O, the start and the end of all Israeli politics, pause for thought, okay? It's not enough to have a couple of falafelim, as it's called in Hebrew, in order to get elected prime minister. Clearly not. The Palestinian Israelis, again, you will talk about this, are out and down, exactly why you will talk about. It is very likely at this point that the next government will be a right-wing government, and taking a sort of big step back and thinking in more historical terms, one way of thinking about the reasons, the structural reasons for this domestic collapse, not quite collapse, but restructuring of the left wing and certainly collapse of labor, is that the old world onto which the left was built from the early 90s onwards, namely the world of a 2-state solution, that world basically is dead. It's done. Okay? Maybe there is a very small chance it will still come around, but really the chances are very, very slim. Labor specifically, and the left more broadly, is associated with this old model. This old model doesn't have enough buyers anymore. The policy model doesn't really have enough buyers anymore. So it's basically like somebody who's trying to sell something that is out of fashion, okay? And in this situation, you can try to out right-wing Netanyahu, but you're not just exactly and immediately going to get there. That's the domestic part. And the conflict part, I'd say, is that there appears to be a really historic alignment of a domestic and an international situation. The domestic situation having to do with the fact that Netanyahu, as you know, is basically in the process of being probably indicted for a number of corruption scandals, which makes him weak and opens him up for extreme policy pressure from the right. And the international juncture being a President Trump, who is basically not only ready, but quite willing to go with really much more radical right-wing sort of motives than we would have had before. That includes all sorts of different things. We can talk about them later on, such as basically doing something, namely recognizing Israeli sovereignty over the Golan. That's not something particularly right-wing. However, it may have right-wing conclusions, or rather implications, because it may be taken as a model to be applied to the West Bank, okay? To extend Israeli sovereignty over parts of the West Bank at the very least. So this is a really particular historical juncture between a domestic situation and international situation. And that could, it doesn't have to, but it could lead to a turning point in the conflict. One that is historic just as the turning point of the early 90s, when the Israelis and the Palestinians, for different reasons, were basically pushed into the negotiation table. What it would mean, such a turning point, could mean the real implementation forever of a sort of a one-state solution that, however, for the Palestinians is not really acceptable. A 1 + 1/3 state solution, something of that sort, okay? Ultimate upshot, what's really interesting, I think, in a certain sense, is that we go back to sort of, my initial point about the status quo, that the Likud is the status quo party. Well, if you are pro-status quo for too long and you try to deepen it and you do all sorts of different things in order to be able to do so, you apparently sometimes end up destroying it. And we might be at this point now. It's not clear, may happen, may not happen. We might be here. And with this, I hand over to Professor.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Cyrus, for the good picture you gave. I'm going back to the seats in the parliament to pick up on the part he skipped, meaning in Israel, out of 8.8 million population, almost 21% is classified by the government as Arab. The Arab actually includes minorities such as the Palestinians, citizens of Israel, which is the majority into the minority of the Arab Israelis. You have the Druze minority, you have the Circassians, and the Bedouin are as well considered as a minority. Now, if you look at the seats in parliament, you can see that only 10 seats were won by the Arab parties. The Arab parties means mainly 4 parties who this time did not work jointly. Actually, there was an alliance between 2 of them, namely the UAL, which includes the Islamic movement, and Balad. And while the other, Hadash, the Communist Party, let's say, and Tal, the party of Ahmed Tibi, ran together. Which meant that in comparison to earlier election, namely the last legislature, they lost 3 seats. They have 10 seats now, and they lost 3 compared to the 2015 elections. Second point is that the Arab voters this time showed up in less number than whatever previous elections we may remember from the early 90s onward. Actually, the figure is estimated between 50 and 52% maximum of the Arab voters. However, what is interesting to see is, first of all, that the Meretz party would have not made it if the Arab voters had not voted for the Meretz, meaning that at least one seat that was won by the Meretz party, it was because of the Arab voters. Otherwise, the Meretz could not have made it for 4 seats. As well, one may say, for the Druze minority, it seems from analysis that their, let's say, their voters were split basically between the Blue and White Party and the Likud Party. This is an interesting issue as well that can be put together with the reason why there was a lower rate of voters among the Arab voters. In total, there are 2 main reasons. First of all, the national law, the new national organic law, the equivalent of a constitution, which was passed in Israel last August 2018, did not grant national right to Israeli citizens of non-Jewish origins, meaning that in Israel only they are all, the citizens of Israel are all citizens, but not everybody has national rights, meaning that only the Jewish population, the Jewish citizens have national rights, means that they are the only one that they have a right to self-determination. And to this there are a number of strings attached in terms of owning and buying property, I mean estate property, etc., etc. So this reason definitely was one of the reasons why Arab voters showed up in less number. And for the Likud, for the Druze, the new national law was particularly hard to accept because in the Israeli system, but in the Israeli army, the Druze minority has been always supporting the successive Israeli government. So the new national law marginalized them, and marginalized them to the extent of not recognizing them as having national rights. Second point, definitely among the Arab parties, the absence of a joint list may also explain the lower number of voters that showed up at the election. But now with all this background, Cyrus rightly said what is the domestic, regional, and international perspective. I would say that, first of all, as far as the Palestinian Authority and Hamas are concerned, there we see, well, Hamas and the PA right now, they are struggling against each other. This is not new. They have been kept divided for years now. But the recent declaration of Netanyahu, who said that he considers Gaza not anymore under the PA government, as contributing to inflame the rivalry between Hamas and the PA, not to speak about what the Washington Post had been publishing during the weekend concerning the possible content of the already famous and still unveiled Trump plan, the ultimate deal or the deal of the century, how it is called, which would be his plan, his peace plan. Meaning that, as Cyrus has already underlined, there is, in fact, the idea that seems that will materialize, whereby Trump will not grant or will not go for giving sovereignty to a Palestinian Authority over the occupied territories, but rather granting autonomy, coupled with economic incentives, a sort of economic peace, which is the old story from Oslo and even before onwards, there has always been this idea of giving the Palestinian better economic conditions without negotiating a political peace. But second, the serious point is also the fact that a few weeks ago, Trump admitted that he wouldn't be hurt if Israel annexed the Golan, saying basically it is 50 years that Israel occupies the Golan, so why not annexing it? Which opens up the path to a possible analogy with the West Bank. This is, of course, outside any international law criteria, but this is a possibility, and concretely speaking, personally, I think that if there is a move towards annexation of the West Bank, in a first time, it will not be all the West Bank. It will be the Area C, meaning at the time of the Oslo process, the West Bank was divided into Area A, B, and C. Area A under Palestinian control, 20% of the West Bank. Area B under a mixed administration of Israeli and Palestinians, and Area C, basically 60% of the West Bank under Israeli control. So definitely, if there is a plan of annexation by the Israeli on the West Bank, it will be the Area C plus the Golan. Therefore, as Cyrus concluded, we are back we are back some way to the beginning of the Oslo process, in the sense, or before the Oslo process, because there is a stalemate, but it's not of the same nature. There is no possibility. I mean, for the Palestinians, they don't have any leverage to negotiate whatever, and therefore the possibility of a one-state solution is an open possibility. But one state where basically there will be one dominant part, which will be the Jewish Israeli citizens of the state with their tools as the army. One point on which and this is a footnote before maybe beginning the conversation, is the votes of the soldiers. Because the soldiers, and I think this is an important issue. From what I gathered, it seems that they granted one seat to the Likud and one seat through their votes, one seat to the Likud and one seat to the blue and white. And they put the finger on that because the position of the army, or especially the officers and upper officers, have been very critical of Netanyahu's policies. So how the army may play a role there, I mean, the rank and file soldier and the officers, of course, they are not the same, but still, I think that it will be a party in the domestic politics in Israel, which will be important to follow. So yes, this is what I had basically to highlight to begin the conversation.
Is this already on? Yes, it is. Thank you. One way of starting our quick conversation before, as mentioned, Q&A starts would be to ask Riccardo. I'm really curious how you read the wider Arab reaction to the results outside Israel/Palestine.
Is there a reaction? As far as I know, I didn't see much reactions. Actually, if one goes back to the rumors related to the Trump peace plan, when it comes to proposing the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza economic incentives, who will be paying the bill? Apparently, a big chunk of that money will come from the Gulf states, meaning Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, to be negotiated. I mean, the implication of a number of Arab countries in support of the possible Trump plan, which has not yet been disclosed, has to be seen, of course. But I fear that the implications of the Arab countries, once again, will highly disrupt the Arab, And nobody, I mean, Egypt would be the closest party implicated for many years in the mediation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So far has been silent. Syria and Iraq have other domestic problems to solve. Lebanon is busy with the results of its own elections. Jordan, for the moment, is not talking, but there is the issue of Jerusalem. I mean, officially, the Hashemites, the monarch in Jordan, are the official guardian of the holy sites, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And the point of seeing Jerusalem, I mean, losing sovereignty, or at least the guardianship, because this is also something that one may imagine that Trump may be dealing with the Saudi monarchy to hand over to the Saudi the guardianship of the Dome of the Rock, which would put flames on all the rivalries between the Hashemites and the Saudis. I mean, this would be a horror prospect. Anyway, no, as far as I see for the moment, maybe we have to wait for the disclosing of the Trump plan, and probably there we will have more or less a strong reaction by the Arab world, definitely. Yeah, maybe it's me for raising a question for you. Yes, when you see the internal. Yes, sorry. No, I wanted to ask Cyrus, based on the analysis he made and the composition of the new Knesset, how do you see the possibilities of negotiating other alternative schemes than the ones that everybody sees as, inverted commas, natural? I mean, Netanyahu has won, his right-wing alliance is performing well, will perform, we don't know yet, but how do you see possibilities of negotiations outside this already prefigured scheme, if any?
I think the only possible alternative would be what is called the Great Coalition, Grand Coalition between the Likud and the Blue and White Party. The bottom line is, I think the chances for that are very slim. Why? They're not zero. I should add this. Gantz, for instance, Benny Gantz, ex-chief of staff and head of the Blue and White Party, said during the campaign that he has closed the door on a coalition but not locked it. Okay? Leaves the door, in a sense, open. However, I think the chance is really slim for a variety of reasons. The first one is that the smaller parties have, even before the elections were over, not made an ironclad guarantee, but basically said that they will, if at all possible, recommend Netanyahu to be the next prime minister to the president. It's the Israeli president who assigns the duty to form a new government to a particular person. Okay, that's number one. Number two is that Netanyahu won't get what he wants to the same degree from a grand coalition. And number three, a very important constituent, or rather part of this new Blue and White Party, the head of an older party, which is called Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid, is much more anti-Netanyahu than, let's say, he is very anti-Netanyahu. So for him to basically somersault, it's not impossible, but it's, again, very slim possibility.
Yeah. Thank you, Cyrus. Maybe we should open the floor for Q&A with the public.
Why don't you point out so that we don't go whatever, at cross purposes? Yeah.
Okay, here and over there.
Thank you. Professor Schayegh, you referred to the Blue and White Party as the left-wing party, and I was just going to say that it's not exactly a left-wing party unless you consider anything that is anti-Likud is by definition left. But I think the fact that the Blue and White never made any political platform available, and certainly being led by three generals doesn't lend it to definition as a left-wing party. But I would ask you a question in how you both, it's a question to both of you, how you would analyze a possible indictment of Netanyahu on these corruption charges. That process is definitely going ahead. Of course, there are suspicions that some of the deals being made between Netanyahu and coalition partners is to grant him some kind of protection while he's in office, at least. How do you see that unfolding? And if there were to be an indictment, what kind of impact would that have on the outcome of the elections and subsequent constellation of parties? Thank you.
Point number one, no, it is ideologically not a left-wing party. You're entirely right. It is left off the Likud. Your point is interesting, though, because it shows how much the ideological landscape actually has shifted to the right. And remember, I mentioned that both the rhetoric and the absence of a clear pro-two-state basically policy platform means that this is not at all a traditional sort of left-wing party, right? Some of this may have been campaigneering, trying to be vague so that some people from the Likud, some voters from the Likud will come, but that never really quite materialized. Point number one. Point number two, if Netanyahu gets indicted, first of all, it's not quite clear that he will go to prison as long as he's prime minister. There are all sorts of different options that are on the table that he's trying to basically get across, some much less likely than others. He could try to become the next president after he isn't the prime minister anymore, which would get him basically to a place 11 years from now or something like that. So it's not quite clear that this is going to happen in the first place. I mean, I once thought, oh my God, like with this, files, how can he ever survive politically? And here he is, right? And I think a lot of people thought this way. Now, if he gets indicted and if he goes to prison, I think, of course, numerous things can happen. One thing that is, I think, quite likely is that there will be some sort of new election. But that's not necessarily absolutely necessary. You could have a situation in which there is simply an internal Likud sort of fight for the position. This or that sort of person might win out, and the coalition as is, which is not a huge majority, but it's somehow stable majority of 65. You're not talking 61, like seats. It's 65 seats. That majority may stay here. So I really think a lot of different things can happen.
Yeah, rumors go now that the right-wing coalition headed by Netanyahu has already drafted a law that would be probably one of the first laws that will be voted in relation to the non-indictment of the prime minister. This is what Netanyahu and his ally want. So this is already a plan by Netanyahu and his allies. But second point on the precise indictments, there are 3 cases in which he is indicted that are more or less serious. But there is a 4th one linked to the business with the submarines and the Germans. This is a serious one. And Mandelblit in a first stage did not consider that. But 1 month ago, he went back on the decision and he opened the case for investigation. So if this investigation goes ahead, and if it proves serious charges, then I think Netanyahu will be in serious problems, because this is an issue of billions and billions for him and all a network of associates from the US, Israel, and Europe. There was here, and then somebody over there, and then there.
Thank you very much for your great analysis on the Israeli elections. My question is directed at Dr. Bocco. You touched upon the American peace process plan for the Israeli and Palestinian issue, but today the Jerusalem Post reported that the Mahmoud Abbas is ready to meet with Israelis with no preconditions as long as the invitation for the meeting came from the Russians. I wanted to shed some light on the Russian role in this peace process plan.
Well, first of all, the fact that Abbas, who is not considered a partner for peace by the Israelis, actually he never objected to meet on grounds of open discussions. Now, the fact that Russia is suggesting a role for itself is part of the wider strategy of Russia in the Middle East, which is very much conceivable that Russia wants or tries to play a role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and nightmare. What Russia could do, beside the fact that there are also rumors that before yesterday the famous spy Eli Cohen, his body was found and Putin is ready 30 years after they resumed the body in Syria. And then there was the other body that was already brought back. I mean, there are all these symbolic signs of presence of Russia towards Israel. I don't think that from the American point of view, the Russians constitutes. I think that from the American point of view, and this is quite clear from Trump's statement, their fear is China. And if in the Trump plan there will be support to Netanyahu, this will be on one condition, that Israel has to curb its relations, economic and intelligence-wise in particular, with China. The Russian is an old player known by the Americans, China not. And China could have other views, possibilities, etc. So, wait and see for as far as Russia is, or at least this is what I...
No, I agree. I think it is very clear that Russia can't make Israel do things that the US could if it wanted. So it simply doesn't have the same sort of leverage, with one important exception, and that's what's going on with Iran in Syria. But it's probably not big enough of an exception to really count. The Palestinians did what they did, made that statement, because they really, at this point, truly do not consider the United States, specifically Trump, as an honest broker anymore. But to me, this looks more like a move that needs to be done than something that actually could get somewhere. I don't see why the Israelis would say, sure, absolutely, let's cut out the Americans and bring the Russians in. It doesn't make any sense. They would never do this to Trump, ever.
There was a question over there. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for the insight. My question is on. My question is twofold. You mentioned earlier that the Arab Israelis don't have national rights. If you could clarify what limitation this present. The second part of my question is I am making an analogy with United Arab Emirates and Kuwait's as an example where foreigners are a majority compared to nationals. What threat does it present to Israel that citizen without national rights present to Israel as a threat? Thank you.
These are two very different situations, right? So in the latter case, you have people who literally came from the outside who do not have citizenship rights. In the former case, the Israeli case, you have an indigenous population which does have citizenship rights, but for various political and historical reasons has a minus attached to those rights, right? Now this has both formal and informal consequences. Formally, for instance, perhaps the biggest one has to do with migration. Who is allowed and not allowed to migrate freely to Israel? Jews, no matter where they are born, do have the right. Palestinian Arabs do not. There are others. There are also informal consequences, such as the fact that sort of a discrimination like this opens the doors and the gates and the doors for people to basically discriminate, right? Whether that has to do with sometimes opening a bank account, whether it has to do with where you want to live or not to live. For instance, right now there are a number of different smaller, in Israel itself, smaller towns or larger villages, you want to call them, that are Jewish in nature, that for so-called social reasons basically frees Arabs from coming there. They don't say it's ethnic, they call it social acceptability, but what it basically is ethnic. So it has a real-time consequence, both of, again, governmental formal and non-governmental informal sort of nature.
Yeah, I fully share what he says. Other example of the discrimination inside Israel between Palestinian or Arab citizens of Israel and Jewish Israeli citizens, they do not have access to the same schools. The education system provides for a division of schools according to your ethnic origin and religion, which is a way, I mean, the importance of education in socializing citizens in every state is extremely important, as all of you know. In the specific case of Israel, it proves, the role of education proves how being raised, I mean, being educated in different schools with different curricula will affect your future, let's say, sense of belonging. No comparison with Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates for the reasons that Cyrus already outlined. Yeah. There was a question over there, and then a question there, and then a question there. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you very much for both of you. I just want to ask a question to Mr. Schayegh. First of all, because you mentioned this group, no war until necessary, I want to remind you in 2015, Netanyahu was elected after the war, Protective Edge, in which, I don't want to remind you about the UN report, but as well, more than 1,000 have been killed. And I don't think that this is one of the reasons why Netanyahu was elected, in this, the only democratic state in the region. The second issue in which I want to add to Mr. Bocco, which is the right of self-determination just applied for, any Jewish person or to return back to his country. But I want to remind you that more than 7 million Palestinians, they doesn't have this right. And if we don't want to mention these 7 million, I want to remind you about the 700,000 who have been really forcibly displaced during the Nakba. And to add, one of the laws in which discrimination, many laws were discriminated what's called minority Arabs. One of them, they doesn't have the right to commemorate the Nakba of 1948. Thank you.
A quick note. I mentioned specifically that when I wrote no war, I meant no unnecessary war from the point of view of Israeli right-wingers. This is a really important distinction. I also mentioned that obviously there were wars, and as you pointed out, they had really, really grave consequences, including massive loss of life. There's absolutely no question about this. So, what I'm talking about is, I made a political argument, not an absolute argument that there is no war. I mean, that's obviously objectively wrong. Why does it matter? It matters probably not too much, but it matters a bit, because there were people who pushed Netanyahu, for instance, in 2015, to go faster and quicker and longer. Bennett was amongst them, okay? Bennett also 2-3 weeks ago told Netanyahu, what? You're not like hitting Hamas, you're not going into Gaza, you're weak. And people didn't buy this enough to make a difference. So this made a political difference. Again, it's not the biggest one, it's a small one that I think bears mentioning.
I think there was a question over there and then here.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. My question pertains to what you both mentioned as the two-state solution kind of is dead, this one state plus one-third state where Israel controls Area C, the Golan, but mainly Area C. How do you think that such a solution could transform the Palestinian struggle against occupation? Because although of course, now you have de facto a lot of restrictions in Area C. I think it would definitely change the struggle in the sense of that the annexation has been formalized, etc. And also, the second part of the question would be, do you think that such a scenario could also lead to increased international pressure on Israel, as, for example, the EU still, and many states still hold on to the two-state solution as the right one to solve this conflict?
I, yes, think there would be certainly European pressure, but would it be enough to make the Israelis go back on themselves? Probably not. Let's also be very clear, this is not a done deal by a far shot, okay? So it's not clear that this is going to happen. It may be, but if it happens, it may be the most clear consequence of the deal that is at the very heart of the right-wing coalition that is now being negotiated. Namely, the far right-wing parties grant Netanyahu cover, legal cover, while he in turn makes a move to the right policy-wise, right? So, would it happen? Let's assume it does happen. What will happen? Well, one thing, it's entirely possible that you will have Palestinian citizens who will be able, if they want to get Israeli citizenship. Will they? Probably not. They're probably going to be like the people in East Jerusalem. As for the others, the problem is, I think the question is not so much, first of all, this is of course not a solution, okay? So let's not call it a solution because it's not a solution at all. It's not going to solve anything. I think Palestinians in what is now A and B will try to, I mean, either go for a third round of violence, a third intifada, but is that going to get them anything? Probably not. Or continue to go down a sort of a civil, disobedience or civil counter-pressure road, but is that going to get them anywhere? At least in the current regional circumstance, where, remember, the big enemy for most Arab countries, certainly those in the Gulf that matter financially and politically, the big enemy is not at all Israel, it's Iran. Okay? So would that be enough to really get things changing? I doubt it. But who knows what happens in 20 more years? You don't.
Okay, let's imagine that the plan of annexation go ahead. Today, the point for any Israeli government would be definitely to expand its territorial base, but definitely not to grant citizenship to other Palestinians, because one of the constant fear over time is the demographic balance. And the question is that if you want to have a Jewish state let's not talk about democracy, but a Jewish state, you need to have definitely a majority of Jewish citizens. So in the case of an annexation, one may imagine a policy of ethnic cleansing. Not the same as in 48. You cannot anymore commit a genocide or an ethnic cleansing like that. But there are ways to displace population, to encourage their departure, or to find ways to clean the land from Palestinian population in the Area C. This is definitely something that have to be watched. What kind of pressure Europe can exert? The European Union is existent in terms of blah, blah, blah. In terms of concrete measures, doesn't work. There is not a joint European policy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict when it comes to take side or to take a clear position with action in relations to non-respect of international law by Israel. This means that unless there are measures such as BDS that are seriously taken as an option to curb the plans of Israel, and Israel, differently from South Africa, uses today the card of saying you are anti-Semitic. Even not to speak about the debate on anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism that has been brought up. So the way the Israeli government will use these different tools to discourage possible critique, not to say menaces, so far has played in its favor. There was a question here.
Thank you. So you mentioned earlier that Netanyahu's career seemed sort of to hang in the balance when the revelations of corruption first came to light, and no one really knew what was going to happen, but it seemed sort of unsteady. And I see a parallel there with what happened with Trump back during the 2016 election, but yet here they both are in power. So my question is, do you see that this is potentially a global phenomenon of right-wing, male, strong personality figures being able to overcome controversies and things like this that would probably disqualify many other candidates?
If you agree, I have a suggestion that we take the last two questions after yours, and then we try to answer and conclude. There was a over there, and over here, and over there. So let's begin by the closest one. If you can have short questions so that we can take all of them. Yeah.
Je vais parler la langue indigène, qui est ma langue marâtre. Est-ce que vous êtes persuadé, en tant que spécialiste, qu'il y a un intérêt quelconque de la part de la communauté internationale à ce qu'il y ait une fin de ce conflit, au-delà des élections, quelles qu'elles soient? Deuxièmement, n'est-ce pas, toutes ces conférences, indépendamment des armes, des sous-marins, des avions, etc., qui sont un marché, toutes ces conférences, c'est de la cinématographie qui rapporte, n'est-ce pas, dans les établissements hôteliers, les taxis, les repas, etc. Alors j'aimerais savoir votre avis.
Merci. Donc, il y a une question là-haut et là-bas. Là-bas et là-bas.
It's not a question, it's a small comment on one aspect of the result you didn't mention. That's why I want to add it here, because it's perhaps on the long term the most important aspect of the elections regarding the Israeli Jewish society. I leave aside the result of the religious parties. The religious parties, I was in Israel during this time, the campaign was completely silent on their side, and they increased the number of seats. Finally, it's not 16, I think, because Likud took one seat of the religious parties for simple reasons, the soldiers, because the soldiers the religious people don't go to the army, so they don't vote for religious parties. That's why at the end it's 15 and not 16. But nevertheless, they increased the number of seats without campaigning, unlike the others. And that's natural on the long term is very worrisome and very important, because it's due not to the program, it's simply due to demography. It's simply the demographic aspect. Since the last elections, the number of religious people, Jewish religious people, has increased. And it will continue, it will go on, because the number of children in secular families and in Palestinian families is decreasing. The number of children in religious families is increasing. So you can imagine the picture in 10 years. And combined with the absence, very lucky absence, glad absence of Bennett and Schayegh in the new Knesset, which is the best news of the week, of the month, it means that Israel will be less and less something like Orban or Mussolini, which is really the model of Bennett and Schayegh, and more like Iran, a theocracy.
Thank you. Last question of Ala Tartir, and then we conclude on our side.
Thank you very much. My question is, as the Israeli occupation and control continues and as the Palestinian state remains absent, and in light of the annexation ambitions and the irrelevance of the two-state solution, do you think that in the next Israeli election we will hear more voices advocating for the 4.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem to vote in the Israeli parliamentary election? If this is too strange or too speculative, would the nature of the one-state reality, the apartheid state of Israel, has an implication on the outcome of the Israeli election next round?
Thank you. Maybe we can try to answer to some of the questions and conclude.
I'll just
Go
make
ahead.
a very quick round,
Yeah.
and then we'll see. No, there is no way that the Israeli political system will allow Palestinians in the West Bank to vote, or in Gaza. I think it's out of the question. Yes, there was a slight increase in the religious parties' representation, but there are a number of caveats. One is the demographics are not as extreme anymore, as you mentioned. The second is the Iranian and the Israeli political system are considerably different. It's not going to become a theocracy. And Iran is not quite simply a theocracy either. It's something much more complicated than that. One point, or sorry, the second point. What is the international community, to your question? And does it matter at all in this particular context in which it is actually reinvigorated, where it is actually reinvigorated nation states, and modern nation states, United States is not simply a nation state among others, that fully for their own reasons back up one side. So I think, yes, in general, the international community may have a vague interest in solving this, but it has not the power to do anything about it, I think.
They have the power to sell weapons.
The community, as far as I know, is not a state, so I don't think it will sell or not sell weapons. So I don't think that this will have a particular influence. Meshi. Your question, the short answer is yes. A twofold. There are parallels between these figures, between these male dominant sort of figures, and they network as well, right? So it's not simply, it's both. I mean, we could go into details, but it's really both, and I think the networking is what ultimately really, really matters here. Yeah.
Thank you, Cyrus. We are running out of time, and since some of you have other commitments, I will not answer to all the questions, but I am around, so we can continue the conversation if you wish. Let me say, first of all, that I really had the pleasure. It is our first public conversation, and it was a real pleasure to discuss together. I'd like also to say informally that in preparing this this roundtable, I benefited from comments by friends from Israel, by Palestinians, citizens of Israel. Khaled Nabtawi is around. And from Gaza and from the West Bank. I spent the past couple of days on Skype talking with different people, which helped me to shape up a few of the data that I've been presenting. Thank you for your presence and especially for your very interesting questions. They've been very constructive, and hope to see you again for maybe better news.